Doctor Who Season 15 had one of the toughest jobs imaginable, to follow up 3 of the best seasons of the show with a brand new producer behind the wheel, so as somebody who has been really taken with the direction of Tom Baker's first 3 seasons, and especially the Doctor companion dynamic, having a season with no Sarah Jane at all is kind of a scary thing, and on the whole it's fair to say that I enjoyed my time with this season of the show, but that by the end there were some elements holding it back from being as strong as the previous ones. One thing that really stands out to me when compared to the previous Tom Baker seasons is the drastic tonal shift that we have within this one. You don't even have to watch the whole season to see what I'm talking about, because it can be immediately seen in the first 2 stories. Horror of Fang Rock feels like a direct continuation of the Philip Hinchcliffe era of the show. If I didn't know that he wasn't involved anymore, I wouldn't have any reason to suspect otherwise. It's not just the quality of the serial, although it really is the crowning jewel of Season 15, but it's the atmospheric darkness that is consistent with what we've seen in the previous Hinchcliffe stories. However, as soon as we get into The Invisible Enemy, we see an incredibly drastic change in tone that feels so much goofier and lighthearted than anything we saw in Fang Rock. The experience of watching Invisible Enemy is such a fascinating one because it does feel like quite the departure from what I'm accustomed to seeing in the show at this point. Graham Williams brings something totally different to the show than Philip Hinchcliffe. Here they lean into the silly, lighthearted aspects and stay away from the darkness that helps to make the show appealing to a range of audiences, I feel. However, there are still those flashes of the prior era. I mean, if I was to compare this season of the show to any other era specifically, the closest I could get would probably be Pertwee. I feel that his era does have those moments of darkness, but a lot of it is fairly carefree adventures. Having said that, watching through Season 15, it's clearly not tonally the same as Pertwee's. If anything, it is less stylistically distinct in my mind. I think that does lead me to one of my biggest overall criticisms of this season. It can be quite hard to put my thumb on exactly what it's going for. Even though I enjoy a fair number of these stories, they do feel a little bit aimless directionally at times, especially with the likes of The Invisible Enemy, Underworld, and The Invasion of Time. Although I like that so many different episodes of the show can have their own distinctive style and flair, these are episodes that to me are lacking in much of a distinct style, which comes across as a little disappointing, to be quite frank. I know this is a little broad, but in the hands of Hinchcliffe, I did just feel more safe with any given story. My least favorite serial from the last season still had a fair amount to like. I think when we get to Season 16, we'll likely talk more about where the style goes and what Graham Williams does as the producer in charge of the show on the whole, but within this season, he did have some big shoes to fill, and unsurprisingly, it was a challenge to do so. Now, this season is not without its strong moments, and on the whole, I did quite enjoy my time watching it. The first thing I'd like to highlight is Horror of Fang Rock, which again does feel like it's from another era. Now, that's a weird thing within the context of discussing the season in its entirety, but looking at this individual story, God, it just absolutely rocks. The atmosphere, the pacing, the eerie quality to it. It's just a rock-solid 4-part story that shows the capabilities of the show when it leans into its darkness. I don't want to relitigate my entire review, and I won't, but if you want a taste for the best that Season 15 has to offer, then look no further. Within this new era, when it comes to carving out a new style, I think the closest the show gets is with the Sunmakers. To me, this shows promise in its delightful balance of a fun and engaging story within a disturbing and brutal world. It's an incredibly political story and not a particularly subtle one. I think there's certainly an interesting conversation to be had about how to make political commentaries within the show and the layers of integrating that into the plot versus just saying your message to the audience. I mean, there's a lot to discuss there, and Doctor Who has had so many different ways of executing political messages and really just discussing politics. In fact, too much to get into without really making a separate video on the topic. The point being, I could see this particular style of the show being something that was leaned into as the defining balance of the Williams era. Obviously, every story will be different and should. I mean, it's Doctor Who, they should never feel too similar, but I can start to see a vision there in a way that for most of the season, I just can't. Having said that, it's also the story that arguably most closely resembles the Pertwee era. I feel like I could imagine the Third Doctor running around this setting and dealing with these problems. It's not identical, obviously, but it is a comparison that feels natural in my mind. I feel that I have discussed Leela and the Doctor pretty extensively throughout my reviews, so I don't want to go over the same points to a nauseating degree, but given that we're talking about the season as a whole, it is something that should be addressed. I've said before and will continue to say that I do quite enjoy this new and fresh companion dynamic. It's something I haven't seen before in the show, it feels new, and it helps to give season 15 a little extra something to play with. Truly, I do feel that this duo is one of the best parts of the season, unquestionably. I think that with a less engaging TARDIS dynamic, it would be so easy to become far more bored with this season as a whole. But these two really bring out something unique, which I love watching. Leela is just a totally unique companion, unlike any that I've ever seen before, and seeing the Doctor have such a different perspective from her makes for quite compelling television. Is it perfect? No. Obviously, it's not going to reach the heights of the TARDIS duo that came before them, which is my personal favorite duo of the show, but that's just fine. And I can't blame Leela for not being Sarah Jane. In fact, her not being Sarah Jane works to her advantage, and she winds up being one of the most intriguing characters to ever step foot inside the TARDIS. I have more to say about the duo, but to keep things simple and to the point, they are arguably the best part of the season and consistently help to elevate the material throughout almost every story. Underworld is perhaps the only one that they couldn't elevate. For all of their talents and chemistry, none of that is on display in this story, where it feels like people are just running around, blue screens, not caring about what's happening for 80 or so minutes, and consequently, I also had a hard time really caring. Again, I don't want to relitigate what was said in the review, but in discussing season 15 as a whole, it is worth noting this story, partly because it does mark where the season really falls apart the most for me. Not just in this serial, but also in the final story, The Invasion of Time. Although there's more to like about the finale, this run of 10 episodes really proved to me that this season was not just a mixed bag, but something that could not hold itself together by the end. Up until that point, it had been a mix in terms of quality, but I still enjoyed each of those first 4 stories. But then the end really just fizzles out into something sort of boring and disinteresting. It's quite a shame. I would almost call myself a defender of Underworld, considering that most people seem to be far more hateful of the story, and I can't really say that about myself. It doesn't bring out those kinds of emotions in me, and to be honest, very few things do, but it is by no means a good story. And although I defended The Invasion of Time even more so, man, by the end of those 6 parts, I was glad to see the serial actually come to an end. So it's not just about the quality of the weaker stories, which is a factor, but how this season works structurally. I know a lot of people nowadays don't watch classic Doctor Who seasons in order. A lot of times it's just individual stories at a time, which does make a lot of sense, although with the release of the collection box sets, that has probably increased the number of people watching a season as a complete package by a fair amount, but I digress. The point being, when viewed as a whole, I did feel a bit deflated by the end of this season, which is kind of a sad thing to feel at the end of a season of television. It starts out quite well. I'm enjoying the next few stories, and then there's a run of 10 episodes that leaves me a fair bit more dissatisfied than I had been halfway through the season. It's too bad, and I do recognize that the way I watch the show is going to be different from how it was seen back in the 70s, obviously, but I'm reviewing this season and watching it under certain conditions, so I want to talk about that complete experience. Even more specifically, the final note this season ends on, in particular, was a major disappointment. Whereas I found the prior companion departure to be quite moving and effective, this one felt more like a slap in the face. I went into specifics in the review itself, but to keep it slightly vague for anyone who hasn't seen it, Leela's exit from the show was incredibly cliched in the worst way possible. It's something the show has done before, and I have never been a big fan of, but with this one in particular, it felt both out of character and unrealistic. I quite simply do not believe that Leela would make the choices that she did in this story. So when I say it felt like a slap in the face, that's exactly what I mean. Leela is quite a strong character guided by strong and intense beliefs. She's also very violent but true to the people that matter to her. For the direction they took her character, there should have been far more work done to actually sell where she ends up. I think that there maybe could have been something interesting done with it, maybe, although it would have been quite difficult to pull off well, but in the way that it was executed, it did no justice to Leela herself, which in my mind is a tragic way to end a character, because so much work has been done to create this individual, both by the writers and Louise Jamieson herself, and it was all kind of thrown out the window to give her a quick departure. It's a shame and a real sour note to end the season on. I guess I'm used to it happening every now and then by this point in the show, but it had been quite a while, and it was just such a disappointment to see the show return to one of its weakest hallmarks. Overall, Season 15 marks a significant shift for the Tom Baker era of the show, and generally not for the better. The stories are weaker, the style is less distinct, and all things put together, there doesn't seem to be as much of a cohesive vision for what the show is trying to accomplish. Having said that, I still had fun with this season in its entirety, and consider Tom Baker and Louise Jamieson to be strong leads who add a lot in making this season as engaging as it was. It may not be as consistent as prior seasons, and in my mind it is one of the weakest ones Classic Who has to offer, at least up until this point, but when it's great, it's great. I had a pretty fun time watching this one, and I'm going to give Doctor Who Season 15 a rating of 7.25 out of 10. And that does it for today, folks. Feel free to let me know what you think about this season of the show. I am a little mixed on it in places, but I'm curious to see if there's any strong haters or defenders out there. So I'd love to know what you think if you feel like sharing, and if you join me at some point in the future, hopefully quite soon, I will be bringing you a ranking of these 6 stories from this season. I know there's been long gaps and stuff, and it's been a while, but we're back, and the videos come out when they come out, so apologies for any delays, but I'm making it work as I can when I have time. So I do hope to see you around for some of that stuff in the future, whenever it arrives, and if not, that is totally cool, so long as you know that I appreciate your time here today. And with that said, thank you very much for watching, take care, and have a lovely week.